The setting: Battleship Yamato, the citadel of confidence. The scene opens in late May 1942, aboard the Battleship Yamato, the awe-inspiring flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet. The Yamato was more than just a ship. She was the physical embodiment of the nation's wartime power and pride. With its massive 18.1-inch guns, it was the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, a technological marvel intended to serve as the ultimate deterrent and a symbol of Japanese invincibility. It was within the thick, impregnable armor of this steel behemoth that the IJN's elite strategists gathered. The very venue underscored the mindset: unshakable confidence, bordering on hubris. The atmosphere inside the Yamato's sterile, wood-paneled conference rooms was one of comfortable anticipation, not apprehension. The preceding 6 months had been a period of unbroken, miraculous victories: Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, and the sweeping destruction of Allied naval power in the Java Sea. The combined fleet's commanders felt they were riding an unstoppable wave of divine military fortune. Their primary concern was not whether they would destroy the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet, but how quickly they could entice it into a decisive final battle, a concept known as Kantai Kessen. The mastermind and his imperative: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The architect of the Midway Plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Paradoxically, Yamamoto was the most realist of the Japanese commanders. He had studied in the United States and was acutely aware of the vast industrial capacity of the American economy. He famously warned his superiors that he could run wild for only 6 months, but after that he had no expectation of success. Now, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto felt the clock running out. He correctly calculated that the U.S. Navy's 3 remaining operational carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, represented the last credible naval threat in the Pacific. The goal of Operation MI, the Midway Plan, was therefore absolute: lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive, final engagement near Midway Atoll, a small, strategically vital island 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, and annihilate them completely. The plan: a complex, overextended gambit. Operation MI was a masterpiece of complexity, but dangerously overextended. It involved multiple converging fleets, requiring near-perfect timing and communication, divided into 4 main groups. The main force, led by Yamamoto himself aboard the Yamato, containing battleships and support. The 1st Carrier Striking Force, Kido Butai, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, containing the 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Midway Invasion Force, transport ships and escorting cruisers and destroyers. The Aleutian Force, a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands intended to pull U.S. attention north. This massive segmented plan was intended to overwhelm the Americans by sheer logistical and numerical superiority. However, its complexity introduced multiple points of failure, which the upcoming war games should have revealed. The war games begin: a test of strategy or conformity. The Kenshu, or training exercise, was intended to vet the plan, identify weak points, and rehearse coordination between the multiple forces. Participants included key personnel such as Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, and numerous planning officers. The exercise was not a rigorous, unbiased simulation. It was a confirmation exercise. The rules were biased to guarantee Japanese success. reflecting the institutional doctrine of Kantai Kessen, which dictated that the enemy fleet must be destroyed in one fell swoop. The planners had already decided that the U.S. carriers would only show up after the initial airstrike on Midway, giving the Kido Butai time to rearm and prepare. The exercise began, using dice rolls and measured movement to simulate the inevitable clash. Yet, even under these favorable, biased rules, reality, in the form of random chance, began to assert itself. The first signs of danger. The dice roll. As the simulation unfolded, the dice rolls, representing potential American attacks and Japanese defensive failures, began to produce unsettling results. The simulated American attacks, perhaps representing a lucky hit or an unexpected operational surprise, were far more effective than the planners had dared to imagine. The initial roll predicted that the carrier Kaga would be hit. The umpires recorded it as damaged. Shortly afterwards, a subsequent roll predicted the sinking of the carrier Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. This was catastrophic. The loss of two carriers before the main fleet engagement shattered the fragile premise of the Japanese plan, which relied on the complete, overwhelming superiority of the Kido Butai to survive the encounter. Confirmation bias triumphant. The simulation had, through simple probability, raised a terrifying red flag. The plan was vulnerable to an immediate, decisive American counterattack. This moment represents the absolute breakdown of honest risk assessment. Instead of viewing the dice rolls as a necessary warning about the plan's inherent risks, namely the lack of timely reconnaissance and the danger of keeping armed aircraft exposed on deck, the commanders viewed the simulated outcome as an unacceptable contradiction of their assumed superiority. They were victims of confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. Their belief was simple: Japan does not lose carriers in decisive engagements. This cognitive failure set the stage for the dramatic intervention that would change the course of history. The war games conducted aboard the Yamato were a form of sophisticated tabletop exercise designed to test the viability of Operation MI. The simulation utilized large-scale maps, miniature ship models, and rigid rules of engagement, but its heart lay in the dice rolls and the role of the umpires. Each phase of the simulated combat, reconnaissance success, aircraft launching time, and crucially, damage assessment from enemy attacks, was determined by chance, weighted by established combat effectiveness tables. A specific combination of dice would indicate a hit, and subsequent rolls would determine the severity: light damage, heavy damage, or sinking. The process was meant to inject the unpredictable fog of war into the clean lines of the strategic plan. The simulation was overseen by umpires who, while theoretically impartial, carried the heavy weight of the Japanese imperial military doctrine: the fleet must not fail. This environment of a priori success fundamentally skewed the exercise. The primary bias was already baked into the starting conditions, guaranteeing favorable weather and delayed American response times, reflecting the planning officers' certainty that they had achieved total surprise. Yet even within these manipulated conditions, the raw, brutal truth of probability managed to assert itself. 2. The inconvenient truth: the carriers are hit. The simulation reached its critical phase. The initial Japanese airstrike on Midway Island was underway, and the American Pacific Fleet was discovered to be closer than anticipated. The umpires called for dice rolls to simulate the inevitable American counterstrike, a necessary fiction, even if the planners believed the U.S. response would be slow and disorganized. The dice, representing random chance and the hidden capabilities of the enemy, delivered their verdict. The first roll, the dice fell, and the umpires, consulting the damage tables, were forced to declare a direct hit on the carrier Kaga. The ship was immediately marked as heavily damaged and placed out of action for the remainder of the simulation. This was a severe, unexpected setback. Losing one carrier to an initial, localized strike was a shock that violated the core assumption of the Kantai-Kessen doctrine. The consensus was that Japanese carriers, protected by their fighter screen and superior tactics, should be able to absorb minor losses and still deliver the fatal blow. The second roll. Before the shock of the first strike could fully dissipate, the dice were thrown again, simulating a subsequent wave of American bombers or the failure of the Japanese combat air patrol. The results were even more devastating. The carrier Akagi, the flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, 1st Carrier Striking Force, was declared sunk. The loss of 2 frontline aircraft carriers in quick succession, before the main battle lines had even fully formed, was a psychological and strategic catastrophe within the sterile environment of the Yamato's war room. It was an unacceptable outcome, one that shattered the illusion of guaranteed victory. The simulation had, with unnerving accuracy, predicted the true vulnerability of Nagumo's force. The exposed aircraft on deck, armed and fueled for the second strike, were a massive Achilles heel. 3. The intervention Admiral Ugaki overrules reality. The reaction to the simulated sinking of the Akagi was immediate and dramatic. The highest-ranking officers present, including Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's influential chief of staff, realized the failure of the simulation would cast doubt on the entire massive strategic plan. To accept the sinking would be to admit that the 100% victory guarantee had vanished, potentially requiring a complete reassessment or even cancellation of the Midway operation. This challenged the core belief system of the Japanese Navy. Ugaki, driven by institutional pride and an ironclad belief in the plan's destiny, intervened directly. The demand. Ugaki ordered the umpires to ignore or reverse the results. He declared that the Akagi, despite the dice roll, would merely be heavily damaged and would return to battle within a fixed, short time frame. This was not based on tactical probability, but on strategic necessity. In the rarefied air of the Yamato's command, the plan's success was not negotiable. The objective was to affirm the operation's feasibility, not to expose its flaws. To allow the simulation to end in defeat would be seen as an act of bad faith or insufficient commitment to the imperial imperative. The truth, as dictated by chance, was deemed too inconvenient and politically destabilizing. The umpires, being junior officers, had no choice but to comply. The historical record confirms that in the face of such high-level intervention, the simulation's results were simply doctored. This single arbitrary decision instantly negated the most valuable purpose of the wargame, to serve as an honest warning. 4. The domino effect of denial. The rigged victory. The manipulation did not stop with the Akagi's fate. The reversal of the core damage created a cascade of rigged outcomes necessary to sustain the illusion of victory. The American fleet. In the continuing simulation, Ugaki and the planning staff made further adjustments to ensure the American counterfleet, now facing 4 operational Japanese carriers instead of 2, was swiftly defeated. American forces were treated with an exaggerated lack of competence. The final outcome of the simulation was formally recorded as a decisive Japanese victory, exactly as the planners had intended when they drew up the original Operation MI. The officers left the Yamato not with questions about their plan's viability, but with confirmation of its destiny. The critical warning that the Kaga and the Akagi were inherently vulnerable was successfully scrubbed from the final report, replaced by a fictional narrative of success. 5. The psychology of disaster. Cognitive dissonance. The actions of Admiral Ugaki and the planning staff perfectly illustrate the powerful force of cognitive dissonance in high-level command. The uncomfortable evidence, the dice rolls, contradicted the deeply held belief, the inevitable supremacy of the combined fleet. The easiest way to resolve this conflict was not to change the belief or the plan, but to change the evidence. This intervention highlights a fatal flaw in the IJN's command culture.
institutional pride and rigidity. There was no psychological safety net for junior officers to voice dissenting opinions or to champion data that contradicted the senior officer's pre-approved strategy. The atmosphere demanded conformity, making genuine critical analysis impossible. The entire exercise, therefore, ceased to be a valuable tool for risk assessment and became a dangerous propaganda exercise for the internal command structure. The war games did not test the plan, they merely validated the commander's already fixed conclusion. The stage was now perfectly set for the actual Battle of Midway. The Japanese commanders proceeded with supreme, yet manufactured confidence, utterly unaware that the statistical warning they had dismissed aboard the Yamato would become a devastating historical reality in less than a month.
The real chess master, Joseph Rochefort and the Pacific cryptographers. While the Japanese commanders were celebrating their predetermined victory aboard the Yamato, the true strategic battle was already being won thousands of miles away in a basement at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. was not blind, it was listening. The key to the American defense was Station Hypo. Hypo is the H in phonetic alphabet. The code-breaking unit led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort, a brilliant and eccentric naval intelligence officer, ran his operation from a sweltering, windowless bunker beneath the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet. His team was obsessed with breaking the IJN's operational code, JN-25B. The codebreaker's breakthrough. By late May 1942, Rochefort's team had made critical progress. They knew a major Japanese operation, codenamed AF, was imminent and involved a massive carrier strike force. However, they were not absolutely certain what AF designated. Most analysts in Washington, D.C., believed AF meant a target in the South Pacific, but Rochefort, through careful analysis of message traffic and call signs, became convinced it was Midway Atoll. The crucial ruse. To confirm this hunch and silence the doubts from Washington, Rochefort devised a brilliant, simple stratagem. He instructed the commander at Midway to send out an uncoded radio message stating that the island's crucial water purification plant had broken down and the garrison was desperately short of fresh water. Confirmation in code. Within 24 hours, the trap was sprung. An intercepted JN-25B message, decoded by Rochefort's team, reported, AF is short of water. The target was confirmed. AF was Midway. This single intelligence victory meant that Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew the when, the where, and the what of the attack, while the Japanese believed they were sailing toward a complete tactical surprise. 2. The Yorktown Miracle. 72 hours to save the fleet. Knowledge alone was not enough. Nimitz had to marshal his forces. The Japanese plan relied on engaging only two fully operational U.S. carriers, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet, Task Force 16. They dismissed the third carrier, the USS Yorktown, Task Force 17, which had been severely damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks prior. The Japanese assumed the Yorktown was out of commission for months. The damage. The Yorktown arrived at Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942, with a massive bomb hole through her flight deck, significant internal structural damage, and a gaping torpedo hole on her port side. Standard protocol dictated a minimum of 3 months for repairs at a stateside U-ship. The Nimitz Mandate. Knowing the Japanese were coming in days, not months, Nimitz issued an unprecedented, aggressive mandate: get the Yorktown to sea within 72 hours. The Repair Blitz. Thousands of shipyard workers, sailors, and civilian contractors swarmed the carrier in a frantic, round-the-clock effort. They ignored Navy regulations, patched holes with whatever materials were available, and performed emergency fixes on critical systems. They didn't repair the Yorktown, they made her barely seaworthy and operational. After just 3 days of furious labor, the Yorktown limped out of Pearl Harbor, her crew members still chipping paint and welding as she cleared the channel. She was battered, but she was a crucial third operational carrier,
a variable the Japanese simulation, even before it was rigged, had never factored into their victory scenario. 3. The deployment. A perfectly laid ambush. With the target confirmed and the fleet patched together, Nimitz set his trap. He ordered his entire carrier force, the 3 carriers and their escorting cruisers and destroyers, to steam north of Midway and wait, concealed by the vast emptiness of the North Pacific. The waiting game. The American strategy was brilliantly simple and a direct antithesis to the complex, segmented Japanese plan: hide and hit first. The U.S. carriers would allow the Japanese Kido Butai to approach Midway, launch their initial attack, and reach the critical moment of vulnerability when their aircraft were either on the ground at Midway or being rearmed and refueled on the carrier decks. Nagumo's blindness. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 4 great Japanese carriers, was sailing confidently toward Midway, believing American carriers were still 1,000 miles away. His reconnaissance efforts were insufficient and poorly executed, another flaw the war games had ignored. He had convinced himself that any American ships encountered would be remnants easily swept aside. The stage was set for the clash. The confident, technologically superior Japanese fleet, armed with the false confidence of a rigged simulation, sailing into a trap sprung by a handful of codebreakers and the heroic effort of thousands of shipyard workers. The dice had predicted disaster for the Kaga and Akagi. The reality of the American countermove was about to validate that prediction 3 times over.
5 minutes of reality. The Battle of June 4th, 1942. 1. The fog of war. Nagumo's fatal indecision. The dawn of June 4th, 1942, found Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo in command of the formidable 1st Carrier Striking Force, Kido Butai. He was a skilled tactical commander, but lacked the strategic flexibility needed when the plan inevitably failed. Nagumo's primary objective for the morning was simple: destroy the installations on Midway Atoll to prepare for the invasion landing. The first strike, 0430. Nagumo launched his first wave of bombers and fighters toward Midway. According to established Japanese doctrine, he kept his second wave armed, fueled, and ready below deck, prepared to strike the American fleet should it appear. This was a necessary but fatal risk. Keeping fully armed aircraft on the hangar deck turned the carriers into floating tinderboxes. The critical intelligence, 0728. Just as the first strike returned, a Japanese reconnaissance plane, launched late due to procedural delays, a small but critical failure, radioed a startling and terrifying message: enemy carriers sighted. Nagumo was blindsided. The entire premise of Operation Me, which relied on the Americans being delayed and caught off guard, collapsed instantly. The torpedo or bomb dilemma. Nagumo faced a paralyzing tactical dilemma. The second wave of planes was armed for a ground attack on Midway, high-explosive bombs, while the newly sighted American carriers demanded immediate action with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Rearming the aircraft required hoisting bombs and torpedoes from the magazines, defueling, repositioning, then rearming and refueling, a process taking at least an hour of agonizing vulnerability. Nagumo's initial instinct was to wait for his first wave to land before rearming the second, a delay designed to maintain order, but one that consumed precious minutes. 2. The American assault, the cost of courage and chaos. As Nagumo wrestled with his decision, the American forces, already deployed north of Midway thanks to Rochefort's intelligence, Act 3, launched a desperate, uncoordinated counterattack. The American assault perfectly capitalized on Nagumo's moment of greatest vulnerability. The torpedo squadrons, 0920 to 10 o'clock. The initial American attacks were tragic failures. Torpedo bombers from the Hornet and Enterprise found the Japanese carriers but were massacred by the superb Japanese Combat Air Patrol, scoring virtually 0 hits. Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the Hornet was entirely wiped out, with only 1 pilot surviving. However, these seemingly useless attacks had a profound, unseen effect. They pulled the Japanese Zero fighters to sea level, scrambling their orderly defensive screen and forcing them to expend fuel. The crucial delay. Nagumo, having committed to rearming his planes for the second time, switching back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, was now waiting for the Zero fighters to land and refuel before launching his crucial counterstrike. His flight decks were a chaotic scene of fuel hoses, exposed bombs, and busy crews, the precise moment of vulnerability that Dice had predicted back on the Yamato. Act 2. 3. The 5-minute miracle. Reality strikes. At approximately 10:22 a.m., the decisive moment arrived. The attack was led by 3 American dive bomber squadrons from the Enterprise and the patched-up Yorktown. They arrived over the Japanese fleet not through superior tactics, but by sheer luck, having followed the wrong flight path and running low on fuel. The descent. Commander Clarence E. Dickinson, Jr. and his dive bomber pilots found themselves diving from 20,000 feet, catching the Japanese completely by surprise. The Japanese air patrol, exhausted and depleted from fighting the torpedo planes below, was caught out of position. The Japanese lookouts failed to spot the attackers until the last possible moment. The Inferno. In a terrifying, concentrated span of less than 5 minutes, the American dive bombers rained down their ordnance. The USS Enterprise struck the flagship Akagi and the carrier Kaga. The bombs found their mark, ripping through the thinly armored flight decks and into the hangar decks, which were already congested with fueled planes, exposed torpedoes, and ground crews. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The bombs did not merely punch holes, they detonated the aircraft, fuel, and ordnance on the hangar decks in a massive chain reaction. In seconds, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were reduced to blazing, uncontrollable infernos. The ships were doomed. The dice from the war game were proven correct. 4. The final blow and the psychological cost. The Japanese were stunned into disbelief. The loss of 3 carriers in minutes, the very heart of the Kido Butai, was an outcome that violated every tenet of their military faith and national honor. The Hiryu counterattack. 10:40 a.m. Admiral Tamo Yamaguchi, commanding the single surviving carrier, the Hiryu, launched a valiant but ultimately futile counterattack, managing to seriously damage the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown, barely operational thanks to the 72-hour miracle, Act 3, was crippled, but bought precious time. The loss of the Hiryu. 1,700 hours. Later that afternoon, American planes located and destroyed the last carrier, the Hiryu. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, a final act of rigid devotion to the code of honor. The psychological breakdown. For Nagumo, the 5 minutes of reality were the culmination of every flaw ignored in the Yamato's planning room. The plan's complexity led to the slow rearming. The reliance on perfect timing led to the catastrophic failure of reconnaissance, and the institutional pride led to the vulnerable disposition of his ships. The tactical commander was defeated not only by American courage and intelligence, but by the structural and psychological rigidity that led to the rigged war games. The failure was so total that the Japanese commanders spent years afterwards obscuring and outright lying about the events, attempting to hide the fact that the initial, terrifying prediction of 2 carrier sinkings had been brutally multiplied. 5. The aftermath. The end of offensive power. By the end of June 4th, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 of its 6 frontline aircraft carriers, over 250 irreplaceable aircraft, and a disproportionate number of its most highly skilled veteran pilots and mechanics. The loss was not just material, it was irrecoverable. While American industrial capacity could replace lost carriers within a year, Japan lacked the industrial base and, more importantly, the highly trained aircrew training pipeline to ever recover the loss. The Battle of Midway, sealed in those 5 minutes of chaos, was the strategic turning point of the Pacific War. The dice, representing an honest assessment of risk, had warned the Japanese commanders.
By rejecting that truth out of hubris, they turned a necessary warning into a world-changing catastrophe.